Our text this afternoon is from Psalm 23. We can read that together now. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As far reading of Scripture. Brothers and sisters, Psalm 23 is a rightly famous passage. For that reason, I had always avoided preaching on it. I felt that no sermon could do it justice. But when one of our members joined our church through profession of faith, she asked me to preach on Psalm 23. She first asked me to preach on Romans 8, but I had already agreed to preach on that at another time. So I was forced to agree to preach on Psalm 23. As I meditated on Psalm 23 and read commentaries, it became clear to me that this psalm is even more profound than I had first anticipated. It's not just a few words on a page or an intellectual idea. This psalm is alive. It is a profound statement of something that lives very deep at the bottom of every Christian heart. It's something that's in our bones, almost, you could say. And the words of this psalm are like food that we eat more than words that we hear. Many of us can recite this psalm from memory, and for others, this is the psalm that has come to them on the darkest days of their lives. And so bear with me today, because this sermon is designed to deepen your knowledge of this psalm and therefore also help all of us use this psalm when it comes to mind in those moments when it matters most. So bear with me as we deepen our knowledge of this beautiful psalm and as I preach the message of this psalm under this theme. Blessed are those whom the Good Shepherd leads. We will see number 1, the shepherd, and number 2, the shepherd's care, and number 3, the shepherd's hope. And so Psalm 23 begins with the immortal words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Beautiful. We love these words because we instantly recognize their comfort. But I wonder if we really recognize the magnitude of this statement. Because if the Lord is my shepherd, then two things follow. If the Lord is my shepherd, then I am like a sheep. Verse 1 could be translated as God's sheep, I lack nothing. And I don't know about you, but my wife and I watched that show, Clarkson's Farm. Maybe you've seen it. The show is about a BBC television star who spends a year running a farm that he purchased in England. He purchases 76 sheep to work on his farm. And the sheep are astonishingly inept. They are the definition of unwise in every way. They consistently do the wrong thing. In fact, the only thing they do well is eat. Almost every single thing else besides eating, in giving birth. Even giving birth requires the attention of the farmer. They're expensive to own, they require consistent medical care, and they're defenseless against attackers. And so to say, I am God's sheep, I am a fluffy, white, woolly, four-legged ball of foolishness, it's not very complimentary, and I think most of you are probably saying, I didn't come to church to be insulted by the pastor. Thank you very much. But it isn't the whole story about sheep. There's more to sheep than that. If well cared for and led, sheep can be remarkably productive and useful. They provide food. They provide material for clothing. They can even provide love. But only if they are well cared for, and only then. You see, the well-being of sheep depends entirely on who cares for them, especially modern sheep that are bred for greater wool production and such. And so hence the theme, blessed are those whom the good shepherd leads. And the opposite could also be said and has been said, unfortunate and harassed are those who have no shepherd, or a bad shepherd, we could say. I mean, Jesus says that in Matthew 9, verse 36. He says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep need a shepherd. You need a shepherd. Now, we reach our second fact that we need to think about. What is a shepherd, anyway? I mean, very few of us have ever seen a shepherd or have spent time around sheep. What does a shepherd do? Now, I had to do some research because I quickly realized that most of the images of shepherding that you and I have come from places like England or New Zealand. And shepherding in the Middle East was very different than that kind of shepherding. Curiously, I found a 1910 issue of the magazine Scientific American, in which an author there had visited Palestine and had spent a lot of time with shepherds in 1910. This is very important because shepherds at that time probably lived very much as they had for thousands of years. Palestine was not developed in 1910 like it is today. And so this is a very useful window into what life would have been like as a shepherd like David. Now listen to some quotes from the article. You'll find this fascinating. Number one, the shepherds live entirely with their flocks. It's the Palestinian shepherd. Night and day, their sheep and goats are their sole friends and companions. And that fits with David's experience, right? David wrote this psalm. David would have spent day and night with his sheep, and you see that often in the stories. Now, number two, the shepherds of the Holy Land are men of some initiative and intelligence. Their business is at once an honorable one, yet full of difficulty and danger. For this latter reason, many of them carry heavy wooden clubs or even slings. This is the rod and the staff. We'll get to that in a bit. With these weapons, the shepherd protects his flock from wild beasts, hyenas, leopards, panthers, and wolves. Now listen to this. His worst enemy is not the wild animals of the country, but the roving Bedouins. These are Arab nomads who are always making raids and carrying off sheep, with the result, this is the kicker, even today, many a good shepherd is called to lay down his life for the sheep. That sounds familiar. Jesus says exactly that in John 10. Not an unusual thing for the shepherd to die for the sheep. Now listen, it would be impossible to drive the flocks from place to place unless dogs were employed. There are no sheepdogs in eastern countries. Hence, the shepherd goes on in front, the sheep following behind. One of the shepherd's principal duties is to lead his sheep from pasture to pasture. This is why in the later chapters of John, Jesus keeps talking about the voice of the shepherd and how the sheep follow the shepherd. And often on the stony hillsides of Judea, finding fresh pasture is no easy task. Rough grass grows out of the poor quality soil, the limestone soil, and the fodder is scanty, so the flocks have to keep moving. And finally, here's a quote from the end. He says, "I do not remember ever to have seen in the east a flock of sheep without a shepherd." You hear that? Ever. On some high hill across which at night the hyenas howl, when you meet him, sleepless, far-sighted, weather-beaten, armed, leaning on his staff, looking out over his scattered sheep, every one of them on his heart, you understand why the shepherd of Judea sprang to the front in his people's history. Why he gave his name to their king, why Christ took him as the type of self-sacrifice. Now, it is fascinating that David is a shepherd and then he becomes a king. It makes the association of David and Christ even tighter, eh? And the key point in all of this is that the sheep cannot live without a shepherd. And in order to flourish, sheep need a certain kind of shepherd. A shepherd that nurtures the flock and loves the flock and leads it and defends it. And the big idea of Psalm 23 is that human beings are exactly the same as sheep, and they need a shepherd just as sheep need a shepherd. And that the good life for the sheep and the productive sheep only exist when a shepherd cares for them in a certain way. Hence, Jesus saying, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me." Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." I lack nothing. Okay, so point 2. What does this mean in daily life? Right? Psalm 23 is a carefully written description of the blessings sheep experience with the good shepherd. So, verse 2. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." Now, apparently, sheep don't lie down and relax if they're hungry or stressed. They also apparently won't drink from water that is foaming or moving fast. Hence, he leads me beside still waters. That's where sheep flourish. So a good shepherd always brings his sheep to places where the food is abundant and the water is still. Places of peace, places of prosperity. That is what Jesus is doing in your life, if he is your shepherd. Like the sheep, we struggle to eat when we're in places of stress and upheaval. Now, some of you are going to say, hold on a second, but how come my life is so stressful then? How come I have so much pain and grief and loss in my own life? Isn't the shepherd supposed to be leading me to quiet pastures? Well, the thing that Jesus wants to say to you is he says the pain and the stress of this life is not due to him. Those things come from sin, not the shepherd. The shepherd wants to lead you away from those things to heaven, where you will have a green pasture forever. And even further than that, Jesus is telling us, and David is telling us in this psalm, he's saying, "I am your green pasture." Jesus is saying, if you know me, I am the peace that your soul craves. I am the place where you will find your greatest security and your stillest of waters and the most nourishing of grass. That's why we eat the Lord's Supper. The place of true safety and rest and beauty for a Christian is when he or she feeds on Jesus. Believe it or not, the place of true rest and security is not watching TV or sitting on the dock at the cottage. Those things can be restful indeed and often needed. But that's not ultimately the rest that the soul truly craves and needs. You can have those things, but if you have them apart from Jesus, you will still never find peace. Again, this is why we Sabbath on Sunday. Why do we Sabbath on Sunday? Well, and we go to church. Why would we go to church on our day of rest? That seems like work. No, because the true rest comes when you know Christ. He is the still water of life. And yes, Jesus also feeds you with real food. And so he refreshes our souls. In the ESV it says he restores my soul. I prefer he refreshes my soul. That's why we come to worship, and we don't come to worship to have loud music and, some sort of rock band and some sort of concert. I think there's something wrong with churches where there's just always noise all the time. No, it's about refreshing your soul. You're coming to drink from the pure waters. And if we're honest with ourselves, it's when we meet Christ, that's when we restore our souls. Those are the times in our life when we've been most at rest. And curiously, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. A good shepherd leads his people on the path that's right. And he uses his staff to restrain us when we wander from the path. Curious fact of sheep. When a sheep wants to leave the flock, or even if the sheep is the last sheep in the flock, shepherds say that's almost always a sign that something is wrong with that sheep. The sheep is probably sick. We're all prone to being weak, sick sheep. We want to wander from the flock. We want to take our own path through hills and thickets. We want to try our own way. And Jesus is saying, no, my way is the path of righteousness. A few years ago in Turkey, a rogue sheep led 400 other sheep over a cliff to their death. You know what I call that rogue sheep? Prosperity gospel preacher, Pope. I could go on, but sheep are so foolish that they will follow a bad leader right over a cliff. That is how foolish you can easily be. And you're all prone to being weak, sick sheep that don't want to feed on the right grass and instead want to feed on thorns and thickets. The thing is that the shepherd won't have any of that. If you belong to the shepherd, he's not going to let you do that. See? He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He leads you. He makes sure you follow on that path. I remember countless instances when I tried to wander from the path of righteousness. You're usually able to wander a bit, right? But sooner or later, the staff smacks you in your back. You realize, I think all of us probably have similar stories. Now, the Good Shepherd keeps us safe and on the path of righteousness, but that doesn't mean the sheep will never face danger, you see. The path of righteousness, in fact, is quite dangerous. There are countless threats to sheep. And yet, verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. You see, in Palestine, the shepherd would often have to lead sheep through canyons, dark canyons where the sun would hardly shine. And these canyons were dangerous places because that was a perfect place for an ambush for the sheep. That's where bandits would lie in wait, or wild animals, or snakes, or who knows what else. Sheep know that. Sheep do not want to go through a place where they know there's been danger before. But they will do it. The sheep will walk through the sheep if only they trust that the shepherd can defend them. You might say, well, how can a shepherd defend them? Well, again, as we heard earlier, a good shepherd in ancient Palestine was actually a stout warrior. In fact, this is where David may have learned to be such a good fighter when he fought Goliath. In agrarian society, a shepherd is often training for war. The shepherd, as a result, in Palestine carried a big club, and later on often studded with nails. And they also had a long staff. Both of them were effective weapons. That's why we read, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So one of the most comforting things about a good shepherd is how big his stick is. This challenges our Western notions of Jesus being a fluffy, happy guy. No. You see, one of the most comforting things about Jesus is that he'll destroy your enemies. He'll beat them to death. He's violent with sin, and he's violent with people who oppose his kingdom. And the sheep know that they are safe in the ravine because the shepherd will beat his enemies to death. Now, the woman who asked me to preach this sermon, she lived in the homeless shelter system for 10 years. She lived in the shelters, other times in rooms that people would rent out. On a few occasions, she even slept on the streets. This was an inherently dangerous life. The valley of the shadow of death for 10 years. And yet, Jesus protected her time and time again. He used his rod to keep attacks away and her staff to direct her away from potentially unsafe situations. Many would say that her street smarts kept her safe, but not so. She knows Jesus kept her safe. And ultimately, brothers and sisters, if the shepherd is the kind of shepherd that never lets you go, then we need never fear any true danger, because no danger will ever separate us from the love of Christ. There's no danger capable of limiting Christ's love for us, because he's the king. He's the most powerful figure on earth. And therefore, you need not fear the valley of the shadow of death, because Jesus will walk it with you with a club. And then verse 7, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Again, many times this new member of ours, she ate in shelters or soup kitchens or food banks. These are not always safe places to be. And yet, eating in the presence of your enemies, and yet safe because you know Christ. And in 10 years, she never starved. And even in the presence of her enemies, Jesus was a banquet. There's a sense in which even the Lord's Supper is the same for us. Even in the midst of a society that seems to be turning on us, we eat at the table of the Lord in the presence of our enemies. And the Good Shepherd is there to protect us. In fact, every time we have Lord's Supper, it's only because the Good Shepherd has made it possible and protected us. Because of that, because we have Christ, we have a feast even in a wasteland. Right? And these three images, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows, you prepare a table before me. This is the language of feasting and richness. And David's saying, if you have Christ, even in the presence of the worst enemies, you have richness. And I wonder, sometimes if we believe that. Many of us believe that if we lost our spouse to divorce, or if our children moved away or potentially died in a car accident, if our mental health were to disappear, if we had no money, if we had to live in a homeless shelter system, or We think that if we didn't have the things that we have and the benefits and the health that we have, we think life would not be worth living. We think that if we didn't have a car to drive to church in, that life would end. And so we don't really believe, do we? If we're honest with ourselves, how many of us really believe that if we had nothing and we were sitting in a food bank or at a soup kitchen and we were sitting at a table with nothing, that Christ would still be an overflowing feast? Do you believe that? I think many of us think no, we don't. We cling to the things that we possess and the benefits of this life like people clinging to a life raft. We think that they are the bounteous feast. I know most of us today do this because, or at least I have to extrapolate this because I find this so difficult for my own heart. Like you, I grew up the way you did. Access to good education, good jobs, living in good neighborhoods. We had a church community that was always there, 2 parents, regular vacations. The temptation, you see, for me growing up and for me today is to think that that's all I need. And that those are the things that count. And they are good things. But they will stop being good if they become a substitute for the good shepherd, because they cannot shepherd you, nor can they protect you in the valley of the shadow of death, you see. You see, our Psalm 23 in North America is often something like, my way of life, my possessions, my bank account, the government is my shepherd. And if I keep those things, then I have everything I need. And maybe it's different for other people. Maybe it's like, my mental health is my good shepherd. As long as I can think clearly, I'm good. But Psalm 23 isn't about that. Psalm 23 is about Jesus. And it's making an argument. You see, it's not just some soothing song to sing at a funeral. This psalm is saying something very powerful to your heart, and it's challenging you. Is Christ as good as this psalm says? Do you believe that? You might say, well, I think so. Well, just think about it. Could you live in a homeless shelter and still be filled with joy? Think about the thing that's most important to you, and if it's not Christ, think about living without it. And start to live in that zone for a second and look at your heart. And if it doesn't look good, go to Christ. Go to Him and latch on to Him. Follow Him. Believe in Him. Jesus is everything. He's a bounteous feast. He is a cup that's overflowing. He is richness itself. And not only that, He can actually give you an eternity of riches. David is saying, that's how it is for me. I have the good shepherd, I shall not want. I lack nothing. And boy, David lacked at times. In his life, he lived in caves, often starving and without water. And finally, our third point. Despite our wandering, disbelieving hearts, the good shepherd is near. He's talking to you right now. And He's not just the shepherd, He is your shepherd, my shepherd, our shepherd. We're in a church. We belong to Him even if we don't feel like it. And He has a shepherd's heart, you see. The best of shepherds had a soft heart for their sheep. They loved their sheep. You think of your favorite pet or your child or wife or whoever, thing you love most, and you just think of that kind of love that your heart has for that. That's the kind of love He has for you. He has a shepherd's eye. He looks, he's always watching the whole flock. He knows exactly where people are at. You think you can hide from him? No, he knows where you're at. And his love is welling up for you. He has a shepherd's faithfulness, like the Palestinian shepherd who never left his flock. Neither does Jesus ever leave his flock. Even when we think that society will overwhelm us and our church can't survive the next storm, of course it can, because the shepherd is near. He has a shepherd's tenderness. Not only does he love you, but he's gentle with you. There's no lamb so tiny that he won't carry it, no saint so weak that he won't gently lead, no soul so faint he won't give it rest. He pities as a father, he comforts as a mother. His gentleness is what makes him great. I once heard a vivid illustration of this. I'm not sure if it's a true story. Some evidence saying it is, some not. Anyway, I'll read it to you anyway. Some time ago, a gentleman taking holiday in a rural district came across a little boy minding sheep. The stranger entered into conversation with the lad and asked him if he knew the 23rd Psalm. The little fellow said no. The gentleman said, "Well, let me teach you the first sentence. Say these words after me. The Lord is my shepherd." The boy repeated the words. Now repeat each word again and count a finger as you do so. In this way, right? The Lord is my shepherd. And he said, now when you come to the fourth word, the fourth finger, grip it tightly with your hand. Never forget, Lord, that the Lord is not only a shepherd, but your shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. The stranger went his way, and the boy told his parents at night of the strange gentleman and his lesson. During the following winter, the snow fell heavily in the district. One day, the boy and his sheep were missed. They were discovered in a deep drift. And after the sheep had been dug out, the search party came upon the dead body of the boy and his left fourth finger tightly grasped in his hand. If you read nothing else in all of Scripture and only have this line, that is enough. That is Psalm 23. If you can, in your darkest moment, if the only thing you can do is grasp that fourth finger and say, the Lord is my shepherd, if that's it, if you are so far into despair that that's the only thing you can do, you have Christ. And even if in that moment you won't be able to say the last lines of Psalm 23, you will in heaven. These beautiful lines, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is Christ's promise to you. And if you still struggle with that, just ask someone who's sitting in the pews, who's been here for 80 years. Find somebody who believes, who you know believes. You will find that as you talk to them, that Psalm 23 is not just a bunch of words, but that it emerges from their bones. If that's not enough for you, talk to those who've lived long without God and then return to Him after years in the wilderness. And they will tell you. Not because they're so smart or so capable, because they're sheep. No, they'll give you a long list of how foolish they are. But they will be able to tell you that this psalm is real for them because Christ is their shepherd, just as He is yours. He never abandons His people. All else may fail, but Christ's love and goodness will follow you all the days of your life if only you would be led by Him. For blessed are those whom the Good Shepherd leads. Amen.